Everybody, welcome back to Berlin. Welcome back to SANDEMANs live broadcast. My name is Nick Jackson. I am from Virtual Berlin Tours and Jackson's Berlin Tours. And I'm back to give you another tour. And today's tour is going to be about Jewish history in Berlin. We've already seen from the comments from folks who've joined before, it's a very popular an interesting theme. It's very relevant today. But what I'm going to tell you is a story that you might feel perhaps longer than you assumed, because as long as there's been a town called Berlin, there's been a Jewish community within it. So we're going to start at the beginning, which is why, and I'll show you around in a minute, why I am standing here. It's a longer story than people think. It's a story with flashes of brilliance, but of course it's always and rightly overshadowed by the tragedy of the Holocaust and the just repulsive brutality of the Nazi regime. And of course, no Jewish history tour would be complete without covering that. So sit back and relax, and I'm going to show you around. Let's just have a look first at where we are. Those who were on my tour before, I gave you a little idea about where Berlin began. You would have heard that I was on an archaeological excavation recently, not that far from here, not really much to see from where we are now. Obviously there's a limit to how far I can travel, but let me just change the camera. Because I mentioned Berlin was born as a village, and if you cast your minds back to 1234, you can see here in the distance the spire of St. Nicholas's Church. It was one of three in what was a young town. It was probably about 100 years old. That's 100 years older than people thought until recently. Because gone now, just over here behind these buildings, was the spire of St. Peter's Church, and that's where I was excavating. Split by the river, St. Nicholas, the patron saint of merchants. Around here, the reasons we're going to start here, poking up above the trees, and spring has arrived with a vengeance, is St. Mary's Church from the 1270s. So imagine where we're standing now as a marketplace, eventually with cemetery outside the church. And all around here we have been crowded medieval buildings, and as you can see, there's very little of that medieval town left. It was modernisation, it was the damage of the war, and here you can see the inspirational TV tower from 1969. All of this area was demolished, and the heart of communist East Berlin was built here, and 40 years later it will be here where the communist East German experiment collapsed. So a really poignant place. It changed the world, but we're going to cast our minds back to the beginning. Here is Museum Island, the river, and these two little medieval towns. Because right from the beginning, let's say the beginning of the 1200s, there was a Jewish community within this town. So one of the questions you might have is, if Berlin is in the middle of nowhere, why would, in northeastern Europe, elements of the European Jewish diaspora is a Greek word for scattered, so a scattered population, why would they end up here? And that is a very good question, and that is where we are going to begin. Now, I spend a lot of time actually in the Holy Land proper. One of my great passions and one of the great bonuses of my life is I get to travel and study the archaeology of the Old Testament area itself. But I'm sure you're aware that during the time of the emperor, or the man who would become Emperor Vespasian, in the 70s AD, so just under 2,000 odd years ago, the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, and the Jewish community would start to spread all over Europe. They'd move over North Africa and into Spain, into Western France, the so-called Sephardim, Western European Jewish communities. And others would follow the place where they could survive, and that would be into Central Europe, specifically for Germany along the Rhine, where towns would eventually grow up after the Roman conquest, where generally Roman camps were situated. So for the very early period, shall we say 500, 600, 700, 800 AD, 900 AD, the towns were Frankfurt, Worms, Mainz, down on the Rhine. And it would be there, in a way, that after the destruction of the temple and the beginning of the diaspora, that the great centres of Jewish learning and culture would survive in a place, the traditional Holy Land, where, of course, they'd been uprooted. So the question is, how do you get from the Rhine River to a place that the Romans never arrived at, hundreds of miles beyond the influence of the classical world? And I just wanted to tell you that story briefly, because you would know it, I suspect, as the Crusades. Starting in the late 1000, so 1099, Jerusalem would be taken by the Crusades. The horrendous brutality of hordes of thousands of armed people with their retainers, women, children following behind, these huge movements of people down through Central Europe would shall we say, upgrade persecution against these established Jewish communities along the Rhine River and elsewhere. So people will get pushed further east into what's now Poland and up into this area. There were already elements of trade that those Jewish communities might well have been interested in, but the Crusades is what pushes people further east, and certainly by 1200, 1240 there would have been a Jewish community living within this town, and I wanted to show you where that would have been. Just over here, poking through the trees, you can see what is Berlin's town hall. And in a town that's had such a tumultuous last century of history, a place where all the road names have changed. Just think, there were the pre-World War I road names, then they would have had the democratic years of the 20s, then you've got the Nazis who changed the names of the roads, then East Germany changes the names of the roads, now modern Berlin has changed the names of the roads. On the left-hand side of this building is the beginning of a street called Jüdenstrasse, Jewish Street. And just beyond that, on the other side of what is now a sort of a wide motorway built in the 1930s during the Nazi period, was a place called the Judenhof, the Jewish court. It was a set of houses that backed onto each other, and the Jüdenstrasse, and we're talking now the 12th and the 13th centuries, would have come through here, and will be walking along an area that would have been an extension to that road to what would have been the town wall, where there probably would have been a place for them to bury the dead. We'll be moving there in just 1 second. But we need to remember that that community, not just here, but elsewhere, all over Europe, in, shall we say, the 1200s, 1300s, was always under pressure. But the great story of the Jewish communities within Europe is that under that pressure, they still managed to flourish. They still managed to make, if they can, their lives tolerable. And our story is elements of these flashes of brilliance as they make this brilliant contribution, certainly within Berlin, over the next few centuries. But we need to bear in mind that pressure is always there. In the middle of the 1300s, the community here was expelled. And the reason for that was plague. And we're just going to set up something which tragically, the echoes of which you can hear from the centuries after that. And that, even in the Nazi period, and tragically, dangerously even today, when a people who are essentially 700 years ago illiterate, they haven't got the information that we have now, when they become afraid, they start to look for people to blame. So an episode of plague here in the middle of the 13th century, as they felt that plague, the local population, was some sort of divine retribution, the Jewish community were blamed, they were put under huge pressure, people, there are under this pressure, apparently, some confessed to poisoning the wells. That is one of the reasons the community here were booted out. And for 100 years, they were not permitted to live within the environs of Berlin. But they're allowed back, and in the 1500s, there is another period of expulsion, and that has to do with a man who stands just over here. And I'm going to ask you, I'll show you a picture of him, or a statue of him that's just reappeared, and you can tell me whether or not you know this man's name. So outside St Mary's Church, here on the ground, these red lines mark where the houses used to be. Anyone know the name of this guy? Very famous. Our man's name is Martin Luther. Now, Martin Luther's Reformation in 1517 would change the Christian world forever, but having started acknowledging, of course, that Jesus Christ was born, a first century Jew, Martin Luther, Alexei, you got that right. His Reformation, he would think, would offer final salvation and the grace of Jesus, or Christian grace, to Jewish communities. But as we know, for centuries, in fact for millennia, simply wanting to do their own thing and live their own lives, the turn of Martin Luther against Jewish communities who refused to accept his new Reformed church would cause that man to write the most horrendous pamphlets calling for people to be killed, calling for synagogues to be burned, things that the Nazi regime would use to justify their brutal persecution later as well. So by the 1570s the community were expelled. But in the middle of the 1600s, the European world changed and Jewish communities were invited back, and it would be that 1670, 1671 community and their descendants that would put Berlin on the map as a brilliant centre of Jewish cultural life, eradicated then later during the horrors of the 20th century. And I'm just going to set it up because you can see where he used to live. Just over here used to be a house, just where on the curb where this bus is parked. And in there lived a man that was called the Jewish Socrates, and that man's name was Moses Mendelssohn. And we'll be thinking about him as we move through the city. So, the community under pressure, always. By the 1600s, some families start to arrive, and they were called protected Jews. Now, protected Jews sounds like the state were protecting them, but the realities, of course, were that you would pay to come, pay for this protected status, and you would also have to pay to leave. So we'll think about the details of that 1600s Jewish community in just a minute. Let me just get over the road here. Now I can see a lot of questions coming up. Oh, look here, look, you can see the little red man. That's the eastern traffic light little person on the other side of the road up there. This is the Heidereutergasse. It would have been an extension of the Jüdengasse, or the Jewish alley, or Jüdenstrasse. And just at the end of it, as we come into this street, we're going to see where the medieval wall used to be. So we're right on the limits. The community where they actually lived was essentially on the northeastern side of the city, up against the wall, one of the poorest, most dangerous parts of the city. And this street would have taken them to the other side, where a gate called the Spandauer Gate would have been just down at the end of this road to the left. Now, those who've been to Berlin before might well have come to this area if you're interested in this history, and I've chosen this route. Can't keep it entirely chronological. I wanted to show you something special because I wanted to focus on, for the modern period, two little pinpricks of light in a massive darkness, two little positive elements that remember the brilliant contribution that the Jewish community make, and also two little stories that raise questions as to the local population's behaviour during World War II. And this is the Rosenstrasse, as it used to be called. And there are two reasons why we're going to come here. Over here in 1714, in the corner, under Frederick the Great's father, the so-called soldier king, King Friedrich I of Prussia, the first state-sanctioned synagogue was constructed. And it was here in 1943 that for a week and a half there was a protest against deportation of the Jews. Most people come, as we will, look at this and its iconography. It was created by a woman called Ingeborg Hunziger. It was put up in the 1990s. It was one of the later works, and it commemorates the only recorded public protest against deportations in Berlin, February of 1943. But what most people don't look at, which I think is very interesting, is this bit. Now, if you look here, as we look at the faces, they're never particularly happy. Some are less unhappy than others, and these look relatively benign, but you can see they're not particularly happy. And you can see here there's a tree and people sitting underneath it. This lies away from the main memorial, and this is a very similar image to one of Germany's most famous Jewish painters during the Enlightenment period, a man called Benderman. So I would interpret this as a biblical reference to the time of the exile Underneath the willow trees by the rivers of Babylon, there we wept when we remembered Zion. So the burning of the temple by Nebuchadnezzar, exile in Babylon, the return for the rebuilding of the second temple, only to be burned again by the Romans. This is a reference to that period. You have a man here. So he's confined, he's hiding, but there's also a feeling of security and a feeling of prayer. And here you have a man with the broken violin. As Jewish diasporas all over the world make this great contribution to the cultural lives of the countries in which they are guests. And the broken violin, I think, sums up adequately how that is abused in the 12 years that this was Adolf Hitler's capital. And World War II, of course, the anniversary of the end of World War II, May the 8th. So yesterday, tomorrow, if you're interested, is the anniversary of the Nazi book burning stunt from 1933. So we'll look at this in detail. I'm going to start, though, around the back, and we'll set up the story. Now, I'll tell you a little bit of the details of the fate of the 170,000 Berliner Jews that lived here as Adolf Hitler became Chancellor in 1933. And the statistics work also for Germany as a whole. So 170,000, about 50% of those people had left. 7,000 survived in hiding and were helped by German civilians and others. But about 55,000, just under 56,000 Jewish Berlins were murdered during the Nazi period. By 1943, the deportation trains had been deporting regularly since October of 1941. There was a group of German men, numbering in the region of about 4,000 here, who had a mixed racial heritage and were married to German women. Now, at the beginning of 1943, the great disaster of Stalingrad took place. The Nazi regime realized that the German people it was dawning on them the war was lost. So Goebbels, the propagandist for the Nazi regime, and the man who was in charge of the Nazi party in Berlin from the day it was formed till the day he killed himself above Hitler's bunker, he decided that he was going to arrest these so-called privileged Jews, so that he could announce that Berlin was finally rid of its Jewish community. So on the 27th, or the last week of February 1943, he had them arrested. If you look at the documentation, it was a roundup. The German word for that would be Erfassung. It was not entirely sure, 100% sure, what was going to happen to them. Many of those men were brought here to what was the Jewish Community Organizational Building. It used to be a post office. They were locked up here, and generally you read that they were going to be deported to Auschwitz. It's possible that because of their privileged status and the Nazi sensitivity to their German wives, that they were going to be taken to concentration camps in northern Germany. Either way, neither route was good. Of course, their wives find out. They make written complaints at the main police station at Alexanderplatz, where the TV tower is. They find out where their men are being held, and very bravely, in the freezing weather, they come and face down the guards and protest. The station that we're about to pass was shut down, and so that people couldn't see the crowd. They were sometimes going away and then coming back the next day at night, but they faced down machine guns and the Nazis blinked and the men were released. Teague Neal asks, at what point did they know they had lost the war? That's a very interesting question. I suspect that the head of the German army realized by the end of 1941 that it was 50-50, and by the end of 1942 it was over. But every Friday, reports from within the kingdom were presented to the Nazi elite. What were people thinking? And the German people, by 1943, after the fall of Stalingrad, had realized they'd been lied to. They were fed up with being lied to, and they realized the war had turned, because from then the Eastern Front will be coming backwards until it reached this city where it began in April, May of 1945. So Chris and Curry, do you think they have this intended to have the mosque? No, but at the end of the day, it's an organic material, it's an organic memorial, and as the memorial changes, you could say, so does the memory. It's also very soft, it's difficult to clean. Let's have a look at it. So you have perhaps the protecting hand of the Lord and these two figures here, both women mourning as they stand outside worried about the fate of their husbands. And then a pretty graphic statement here, 1943, the year it happened. It says, the power of civil disobedience and the power and the vigor of love, or the power of love, overcomes the violence of dictatorship. And here it says, women stood here defeating death. And up here it says, give us our husbands back, or give us our men back, which is what they shouted. And it says, Jewish men were free. So a pretty powerful statement. I don't think it's worth getting into if there'd been more of this during Nazi Germany, what the result would have been. It's a difficult debate, because if it didn't happen, why talk about it? But at the end of the day, it's a very important thing to remember, that these women did stand and take that risk, and those men, irrespective of what the final plan would have been for them after they'd been taken from this building, the former post office. It is a very moving memorial, Diana, I agree. So here you can see the couples worried about the fate. Here you can see the women breaking through perhaps the barrier, the windows of the building that they're in. They're incarcerated. And here you can see the mourning women and the incarcerated men, and some elements of Jewish iconography. So you can have the Ethrog there, it's for the Sukkot festival, harvest festival. You've got the Lion of Judah, the menorah, and the priestly blessing that you can see here as well. So very powerful, the women's protest, unique, brave, and a little pinpoint of light, very moving in a massive darkness. So East Germany commemorated the synagogue. There were over 20. And we're going to think about that terrible night in 1938 when most of the synagogues here were burned. It used to be called Crystal Night, now it's called Reichspogromnacht. Pogrom is a racially motivated murderous attack. I always wonder about this, because you have the various interpretations. What do you think this is, as this solitary individual sits on a bench? Now, on the one hand, it could be the small incremental attempts to ruin Jewish Germans' lives, and an encouragement for them to leave the country. You can't own a radio, you can't go to the cinema, you can only go to the post office at this time, you can only go to the bakery at that time, you can't earn jewellery, all those sorts of things. But there's another, perhaps more sinister interpretation, because that person is watching this. Now, this story is the demonstration, but there's the famous phrase, the road to Auschwitz was built with hatred, but it was paved with indifference, because the Jewish deportation, or Jewish Berliners' deportation, is one of the main collection points for the march to the deportation stations. I'm going to show you shortly. That takes place early in the morning as people are gathered and marched to stations. You ever wondered why that might be? Why would they be taken early in the morning? This is the building, the post office, originally where they were kept. So now that's the open grassy space, and the memorial is just over there. And just around here we can see a picture of a freight platform at Grunewald. Alexa BP knows that the Bavarian Quarter in Berlin has a very interesting, it's true, it's a very interesting set of memorials where the street furniture, so signs and various other things, are a list of these laws outlawing certain elements of life gradually through the mid to late 30s. That's a very powerful place to go as well. Is this in a residential area? It's not just, this is not just in a residential area, it is in a villa area. So it's not that densely populated because they're very expensive houses. It's where many politicians would live in the 1920s. So it's not that dense. It's there for more practical reasons in terms of accessing railway lines out to the southeast. But it's still there, Grunewald, a very powerful memorial. For me, the taking away of people early in the morning is so, of course, they're not seen by the population. But then you have to ask yourself, why did they not want people to see? And the conclusion I think you must come to there is you don't want people to see because you know what you're doing is wrong. But as we know, it's still done, and we'll think about that further up here. So this area today, the Hackesche Markt area we're about to walk into, is certainly one of the best places to stay if you come to Berlin. It's full of little boutique shops, it's got great accommodation. It's very close to funky parts of Prenzlauer Berg, bars, clubs, that sort of stuff. It's very close to the historic city centre, Museum Island, just a few minutes, for example. In the 90s, this was an area of a lot of empty buildings. This was, of course, East Berlin, and if we'd gone this way, in a few miles, we would have come to the Berlin Wall. Other side of it was West Berlin. If we'd gone that way, to the left, we would have come to the Berlin Wall, and on the other side was West Berlin. So this was like a triangle of East Berlin that wasn't really going anywhere. So that meant they didn't knock down the old buildings and turn it into this. So the old buildings were still there, they were kind of broken and empty, and a lot of the squat complexes and funky venues were set up in these old buildings, one of which still survives, but the rest of it has grown up just like we've grown up, and now it's a much groovier part of town, much more upmarket, some of the highest rental prices, but a great place to stay in terms of accommodation, restaurants, bars and fun. And a perfect location for your visit. So, just over here, in non-corona times, this will be absolutely packed with folks sitting around listening to music and drinking. But at the moment, we've still got a couple more weeks of restrictions, even though Germany's vaccination program is moving apace, and in fact even I managed to snag one last week, so I hope wherever you are your vaccination programs are doing well. Get vaccinated and then we can all travel. So people are noticing, Teague noticed not many masks. I mean, when you're outside you'll notice that nearly all the people here are relatively young. And of course, you know, there's a point, like young people feel that they might get it, but it isn't going to do them too much damage. And that's probably true. But people feel outside, there are certain areas, crowded streets, where it's obligatory to wear a mask, but people here, they feel as long as they're outside, they're relatively immune. Now, this is the Hackesche Höfe. It was an experimental, beginning of the 1900s, complex, very modern, very Berlin, because you had businesses, offices, advertising space, and this was all built, this set of courtyards, to try and alleviate one of the big problems of disease in Berlin, because this was actually the most densely populated part of town, and it was also very crowded and dark. And the way the houses here had been put up in the 1700s and 1800s was to maximize the amount of space that people could rent. Therefore, they were very dark and airless, the courtyards, and hygiene was bad. So it was so prevalent, tuberculosis in Berlin, that it was actually called the Berlin disease. And I'm going to take you through here, rebuilt after World War II, and I'll show you one of the rare surviving courtyard complexes, which has now been dedicated to theatres and little venues. But it gives us a sense of what these courtyard houses used to be like. The wealthier you were, the closer to the front you lived, because then you got, you know, air, light, that type of stuff. But I just wanted to introduce you to things we're going to see several of, and they are Stolpersteine. Now these are brass stumbling stones in English, and what they do is they commemorate, it's a reference to a line in the Torah, which is if a person's name is forgotten, then their memory is lost. So you just need to remember their names. So here you have, there are 60,000 of them now. They were organised by a man called Gunter Demnig. He's an artist, and you'll see the names of a family called the Schneebaums. So you have, it's difficult to see, I'm trying to get it so you don't see the glare. You've got Hermann and Jenny Schneebaum. They lived at this address, and this is their birth date, 1906, 1908. But I wanted to show you this because often people conflate Holocaust victims with other victims groups during World War II. Many people died. Why should, like in the Soviet Union, for example, official reports include 6 million murdered Jews, but just see them as a statistic within a larger, horrendous number of dead. But often when I hear that, I think of Victor Schneebaum, because he was deported and murdered in Auschwitz, and he was born in that year and went in that one. And I don't think Victor can be blamed for anything. So we'll see more of those. They're all over Germany now. They're also in Poland, the Czech Republic. They're spilling out beyond other borders, but they're very, very poignant. One name, a group of families, their relationship, their ages, and outside where they lived. Stumbling stones, a very interesting project. Now I'm going to take you into a very different courtyard now, and I hope that my feed still works, so let me know if I'm breaking up. Well, we historians, this reminds us of something else. First up, it reminds us of what this area was like, 150 odd years ago, where people were kind of sharing apartments. One family worked during the day and the other came the night shift. It's also busted, shows us what it looks like. Period of East Germany, renovated recently. But I wanted to tell you quickly about a man who was only rediscovered really in the 1990s by an academic researcher who worked up here in these rooms. Now you can see here there's a picture of Oscar. Up here you might be able to see, if not I'll show it to you, but you can see a name, Anne, that's Anne Frank up there. And in here worked a man called Otto Weidt. Otto Weidt came from Rostock. He was a wallpaper, he did wallpaper in people's apartments, but he had a congenital eye disease. In the 1920s he was very active as a radical left-winger. He was a social democrat all through his life. And because he was losing his sight, he decided to open a new business. So that new business opened in 2 different places in Berlin. It was making brushes. And one of the reasons why I have a picture of Oskar Schindler here is that they managed to do the same thing, and that save some of their Jewish workers as a result of their humanity, and 2 other things. Wheeler dealing and bribing sweet-talking Gestapo agents to help their workers, as well as getting the job that they were doing designated as essential war work. So he opened a brush factory that supplied brushes to the German army. But by 1941, 1942, he can't stop businesses operating with about 30 Jewish workers, some of which were blind. As word got out, as other German Jewish families were put under pressure, they heard that Weidt might help them. They all came to Berlin and Otto Weidt would help them. So as raids came, he got advance warning. He managed to buy the staff off. He had a desk and people would then hide. At the very back of this building he had a windowless room with a cupboard over the front door where he hid in 1943 the Horn family, the father of which was blind. They were eventually betrayed and deported. And when it became, the pressure became too much and his workers were being deported to Theresienstadt, concentration camp in the northern Czech Republic, he and his neighbours from a previous factory building, one was a doctor, one was a printer, they managed to organise food parcels, medical parcels to support those people in Terezin. But 2 women stand out from the story. One is a woman called Inge Deutschkrohn. She and her mother would be protected by Weidt. He gets her fake identification papers. Eventually, eventually, they were actually, the Deutschkronen mother and daughter were kept in a house in Knesebeck by some friends, and then aided and supported by Weidt's little set of helpers. They survive the war in Berlin, eventually in Potsdam. But the story of Alice Weidt is even more amazing, because Alice Weidt was the young member of the Weidt family. He can't stop them, her family, going to Terezin. He manages, just like during the factory action we thought about in 1943, he just closed his business. So when people came to take those Jewish workers in the same operation at the beginning of 1943, that would see the men taken to the Rosenstrasse to come to work. But they're allowed then to get, let me just stop. They're allowed then to get parcels. He supports them, and they have a little sort of coded message system set up. She starts to get worried because in 1944, the Licht family would be deported to Auschwitz. Now, young Alice is the only one that survives that arrival. Otto Weidt travels to Auschwitz to find out what happened to Alice Licht. He's heard that she survives arrival and has been taken to a place called Christianstadt. He then gets message to her saying, I've rented accommodation in the town. If you manage to break away from here, because there's going to be an evacuation surely in the next few months, this is towards the end of 1944, there's food and money and clothes for you. She manages to break away, survives, comes back and lives with Otto Weidt and Mrs. Otto Weidt before she heads on to New York. So again, two stories of Otto Weidt and his efforts, his luck, his bravery. And though Alice Licht is no longer with us, Inge Deutschkron is still alive. He was given righteous amongst the nation status. So if you're ever lucky enough to get to Jerusalem and you go to Yad Vashem, you can find his marker there. So we walk through these courtyards. I want to talk in these little tunnels, perhaps. I might lose a bit of coverage, but we're going to be coming out onto the Sophienstrasse, and we'll pick up the story of the Jewish community who came in the 1670s. Teague wants to know, how did I meet the esteemed Chris Sandeman? That's a whole other tour. But shocking long time ago now. Up here there's a billiard room, but it's too along one side of the. But have a look at this. This is the Sophienstrasse. If you're interested in literature, it's one of the most famous. It appears in the first page of the famous book, Berlin Alexanderplatz. What I'm going to be doing is heading down to a street that was called, during the East German years, they called it the Street of Tolerance. Before World War II, it was called the Street of the Columns. And it's very interesting with some very poignant memorials. 1670, 1671, in Vienna, wealthy Jewish families who were suffering the same type of pressure that Jews all over Europe were suffering at various degrees, which was essentially restricted status, overtaxation, limit to the numbers of businesses that they could open, and generally restriction from being members of the guilds. Now this thing here is the Berlin Handwerkervereinshaus, so the Berlin sort of skilled workers Verein, and by the time this was opened, the Jewish community had actually temporarily achieved full status and kind of emancipation, 1815. Then it's taken away from them, then it's returned towards the end of the 1800s. But this building here was essentially a union meeting place, and during the fight for power, the Nazis would speak here and the communists would hold their rallies in here. Now it's a rather funky theatre, and you can see here a little glimpse of what this town would have looked like at the time that we're thinking about in the 1600s and the 1700s, because these old buildings managed to survive. So the Jewish community in Vienna, there were 50 families, and they suffered the same kind of persecution in Berlin. For example, right at the very beginning, the main trades that would have been, could have been practiced here in the 1200s, 1300s would have been things like wood, trade in wood, various grains, and wool. So some of the very first mentions of Jewish communities within Berlin are restrictions that they're not allowed to operate within those businesses. So that would leave them niche industries, and by the 1600s it's things like gem cutting, medallion cutting, gold and silver, silk, velvet industries. In fact, Mendelssohn, one of the great minds of Berlin cultural life, would work and become part owner in a silk manufacturing, and he's buried in the cemetery just around the corner. But in Vienna, 50 wealthy families and their retainers were expelled, and things had changed within 16th or 17th century Europe, because there'd been a great war as a result of that man, Martin Luther, again. So Martin Luther doesn't just spark off anti-Semitism, but he causes a war which eventually would last 30 years, finishing in 1648 as Protestant powers, to which Berlin belonged, and Catholic powers all over Europe battle it out. It was a dreadful time. Berlin's population had dropped to about probably less than 12,000 occupied houses. So remember our four, if you were on my first tour, our four royal family members? The first of those, the Great Elector, invited Huguenots and Dutch, very wealthy, powerful countries with international trade, and they had skills that Berlin wanted to boost the population. But he also invited the families from Vienna to come here. And the reason for that was that financing, certainly of things like war and young, ambitious states like Prussia, they were looking for some sort of finance organisation that wasn't caught up in the inter-Catholic and Protestant or inter-royal family rivalries, so that they'd have, hopefully, these banking families, as they would become, they'd have loyalty just to their patron, rather than perhaps being slightly less trustworthy and being connected to other European royalty. So Jewish families were often then favoured, and these families would come and open businesses, and from there you'd get, for example, the great families like the Itzigs and the Levines and the Aarons and the Ephraims, all of which would become financiers and organisers and officials protected by the Prussian court for the court of Prussia. So here we come onto the Grosse Hamburger Strasse, and even though there's this weird deli at the end of it, you can't buy a big hamburger on the street. Down there is where the Hamburg gate used to be, so that is Torstrasse, Gate Street. You have 7 gates there. Beyond that was countryside. Now in 1670, this area hadn't been developed. What you had here were barns. You had just over 20 state barns or sheds. That's why this area became known as the Barn Quarter. And you got some interesting places to worship, but let's just get briefly back to our story. Protected Jews had to pay to stay, and the family and their firstborn, certainly by the middle of the 1700s, would have residency rights. But then you had 5 levels of restriction below that. So your second child, for example, would have to apply for, pay for, and perhaps be denied a right to settle where his parents and elder brother used to live. One of the most peculiar and perhaps sort of laughable and rude elements were that Jewish communities within Berlin in the 1700s had to, as they got married, they had to. Ich streame, es wird nicht aufgenommen, schönen Sonntag noch. Absolutely ridiculous. But, ich wird nicht aufgenommen, it's live. Keine Ahnung.
Zwei war, glaube ich.
How many viewers?
So they were given a certain amount of porcelain, depending on how wealthy they were. So they're given porcelain, and then they're expected to sell it and return that money to the coffers. So the poorest would be given 28 thalers worth of porcelain. But what we're looking at here is St. Hedwig's Hospital. So this is a Catholic hospital, and in there you have a Catholic place of worship. One of 3 places of worship on the street. Yeah, just having a chat with those locals because, you know, I could just ignore them, but they weren't going away. I was just talking to these dudes on the street because even though teenagers think that they are the super funkiest, most high-tech bros in the world, it hasn't seemed to dawn on them that if you're walking along live streaming, that you're not making a skateboarding video. I mean, call me old-fashioned. So they're always under the impression that they are being filmed and either, you know, think that they're going to be on TV or they start to just make silliness. I think it's because they're put under pressure. In a minute we're going to see a Protestant church. Now, that's a rather interesting little view. Let's see if we can get it without the glare. And just down here you can see where we're going to finish. That is the synagogue. The street hasn't got any trees on it. That's rather interesting. Most of those were cut down at the end of the war. East Germany generally didn't replant trees in these sorts of areas because, of course, they wanted better to monitor people on the streets. But I just wanted to look down here because on this corner of this house here lived a woman called Regina, Jonas. So when the community came, they were relatively Orthodox, Central Eastern European, Ashkenazi Jews. But for details I'll give you in just a sec, as they live and absorb the Enlightenment Prussia, they start to absorb elements of German and European philosophy, which produces a blend which would become known as German Jewry or Reform Judaism that is then taken from here later all over the world. And Regina Jonas is a good example of the product of that because she would become the first ordained female rabbi. It's our second place of worship, the Sophienstrasse, Sophie's Church, a Protestant building. So now we've seen 2, Catholic and Protestant. And if you look here, this is one of the places where you can see they've renovated these former clergy buildings, now private apartments. But if you look here, you can still see the bullet scars from the Battle of Berlin raging the last 2 weeks in 1945. And it's dangerous. This thing is here to stop bits of stucco. So these bullet holes come from the Battle of Berlin in 1945, and they're still here today because no one's got round to renovating the building. Regina Jonas she studied at another product of Enlightenment Judaism within Berlin. It was founded here, it was the Center of Jewish Academic Studies. She wasn't the first woman to do that, but she did take it a step further. There were 3 others who managed to graduate, if you like, and were given sort of respect as religious teachers. But in early 1940-41, she applied for and was eventually ordained in Osnabrück. She refuses to leave. She was deported. She went to Terezin, where she was then deported in 1944, together with the Licht family, for example, to Auschwitz, and was murdered. In Terezin, nobody mentions her presence, the female rabbi, and she was again, like Otto Weidt, rediscovered by academics after the war, but she lived in the house just down there. This house is completely gone. This is a 90s memorial called The Missing House by a guy called Christian Boltanski, who was an artist in residence in Berlin. He saw the house and he decided to try and find, you might be able to see the names of the people that lived on each of the apartments on either side of the staircase. The house was bombed, but it gives you an idea of this community. Did they talk to each other? How well did they know each other? What did one neighbour think when their Jewish neighbour was deported? Did they know? What did they say afterwards? What did they feel for the rest of their lives? Really very vivid and so simple. You just give the name and the profession of the people that lived in the house. Moses Mendelssohn came as a teenager with his rabbi from Dessau in the early 1700s, and he came just at the right time, the last of our 4 leaders, the peak of the Enlightenment, with the Enlightenment King Frederick the Great. King Frederick the Great is on record as most Prussian monarchs as essentially anti-Semitic, but he thinks, in fairness, with his Enlightenment views, Jewish Prussians should be treated on the same level as people, as Christians, under the law, which is a step forward. Mendelssohn, as we'll hear in a minute, made huge contributions to a debate on the place of Berliner and German Jews within Germany, with his philosophical treatises and writings. But after he died, his mantle was taken up by a man called David Friedländer. Yes, they were bullet holes. Every time you see what looks like a bullet hole in these buildings, that's what it is. David Friedländer in 1778 would continue Mendelssohn's work, and this is the Jewish Boys' School. So when it first opened, it had a narrow range of specifically Jewish subjects, but it was important because it taught other things in mathematics and geography and various other secular subjects, if you like, which, as it does today, it is a gymnasium, it's an academic school, and it still stands one of three places. The building next door was the old People's Home, now gone, and then is the cemetery, desecrated, and the old People's Home became the deportation centre for the Jewish community, rounded up and collected from 1941 in October from this area. So Moses Mendelssohn is an interesting guy. He comes here and starts work at the silk factory, but is a very clever boy. He starts to study independently. He learns Latin and Greek, French, German, and starts reading and absorbing the great philosophical debates of the day. He becomes friends with the famous writer Lessing, who he'd visit. They were almost neighbours, and he was familiar with the great philosopher from East Prussia, Immanuel Kant. To cut a long story short, his basic premise was that, rather like Luther, the individual can create their own relationship with God, that being Jewish doesn't preclude you from being German, because that was essentially a private religious matter. And though he's challenged on that, and it begins a debate about whether or not this was possible, which of course goes both ways. Moses Mendelssohn would be the man who would contribute to the beginning of a movement that would produce people who felt that they could be German, and that their language was German, and that being Jewish and German was, and as of course it is, compatible. So when the Zionist movement begins in the middle of the 1800s, so about a generation after Moses Mendelssohn died, many anti-Zionists said, no, this is our land. Why do we need to go back in time, and become peasants again, irrespective of where this destination might be? This is our country and our language is German. This is an East German memorial that was repositioned here, and it says on this place it was the old People's Home of the Jewish community in Berlin. In 1942 it was changed by the Gestapo into a collection point for Jewish citizens. 55,600 or 55,000 Berliner Jews, from infants to pensioners, were dragged to, or bestially dragged to the concentration camps of Auschwitz and Theresienstadt and murdered. Never forget, guard against war and protect peace. And here was a memorial originally destined for a concentration camp for women, but ended up here. And behind you can see the empty graveyard, desecrated by the Gestapo. Moses Mendelssohn's grave originally was round the corner to the right. So now a protected area, the first of the Jewish communities. So from the 1680s they could bury here, and this is where they would build their first houses. Now we're going to go up and try and pull the story together. You appreciate it's a very big, wide, detailed story, so I try to kind of synthesize the main points for you. Subscribe to the channel, because we can do more of these if you just ask specific details. Then you won't miss any of the alerts. So give us a like and subscribe. We're going to go up now and finish the tour by the Reform Synagogue. So by the middle of the late 1800s, this movement of the development of German Jewry had changed religious practices and home life enormously. And if you look at, for example, the number of people in mixed marriages, which horrendously, of course, comes to the fore when the Nazis start to categorize people, you realize that it had been achieved that being by religion Jewish did not preclude you from marrying non-Jews if that was the path that you chose to take. But of course, the roof caves in as after fighting and dying against Napoleon in the Wars of Liberation and fighting on behalf of their pride in their state, Prussia, in the wars of the 1860s and 70s, and 12,000 German Jews dying in the trenches of World War I, over 100,000 Jews volunteering and serving in that effort, finally achieving full emancipation and playing roles at the highest offices in the land. The roof, of course, caves in as the Nazi regime come to power. By the 1st of April 1933, the Nazis had boycotted Jewish businesses for a day. By 1935, you get the infamous Nuremberg laws cobbled together for one of the Nuremberg rallies, which is a very peculiar mix of social and financial restriction, as well as these peculiar references to blood and honor. And by 1935, some Jews were thinking that this doesn't look like it's going to blow over, it might be time to leave. But the poor, those with dependents, people who'd been here for centuries, people who'd built up clienteles and had no desire to begin again, and why should they go when they are German? The exodus initially is slow until there's a huge rush, not just a rush to leave, but a massive rush of hundreds of suicides after the night of violence known originally as Crystal Night. And up here is the synagogue appearing in the setting sun. And you see the Berliners at play. Sitting on, used to be a palace here at the Monbijou Park. Just sitting around drinking a beer in Berlin. In 1938 there was an event starting in March of 1938 for the full context, and that was in 1938 the Nazis had absorbed Austria into the kingdom, and a lot of Austrian Jews were trying to get out of the country. Many of them were originally Polish, and as they flooded back to try and reclaim their Polish citizenship, Poland made them stateless. In October of 1938, Polish and foreign Jews within Germany were forcibly taken to the border, and one of those was the Greenspan family. Greenspan, the youngest, 17-year-old Herschel, was in Paris. But of course Poland had already made them stateless, so they were thrown out of Germany, weren't allowed into Poland, and these families were then stuck in terrible conditions on the border for months. And as they communicated with Herschel, he was outraged. So he runs to the German embassy in Paris and made an appointment to see the ambassador. He doesn't get to see him, he gets to see a lowly councillor called von Rath, who he then shoots several times in the stomach. Now you have to imagine that this synagogue here would be burned 2 nights later, but it's worth bearing in mind the synagogue in Munich had already been destroyed. The synagogue in Nuremberg had been destroyed. So this is part of a longer ongoing process. But on the 9th of November at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, von Rath died in hospital. Now that was a very important day for the Nazi calendar, because the 9th of November every year Adolf Hitler would be in Munich with his old fighters commemorating the attempt to seize power in 1923. So he's there. Hitler has a whispered conversation with Goebbels, the propagandist, then leaves and comes back to Berlin. And then Goebbels goes on the radio and makes a speech where he implies that there might be a spontaneous uprising that night. And On the nights before, with von Rath still alive, there'd been attacks, people had been murdered, but there's a huge upsurge of violence where Germany finally shows its population, Europe and the world, that it's a country, and it had been this for years, that no longer had the rule of law. The rule of law is what stands between civilized countries and barbarity, and the Nazis had already eroded that for certain groups without even changing the law. You just make it about racial grouping. That the law is about the gut feeling of the people's community. So if you don't belong to that community and you're disenfranchised, you're now outside the law. But it becomes clear to the population as over 5,000 buildings are burned, people are beaten to death on the streets, apartments are robbed. The fire brigade and the police stand outside to stop people putting the fires out. And the next day, in the lists that had already been prepared, they were just waiting for an excuse. About 30,000 wealthy male Jews were taken to concentration camps to then be told, we've just spent the last 5 years encouraging you to leave the country and you're still here. So maybe now you'll apply and pay your your massive taxes and get a pitiful price for your business. Usually about 10% of what it was worth, and leave the country. And all of that would become known as Crystal Night. That's where there's a huge change, 9th of November 1938. So by the beginning of the next year, decisions are made by Hermann Goering under the orders of Hitler to try and find somebody who can come up with ideas of forcibly taking Jewish citizens of Berlin and Germany elsewhere. And as the war begins, as we know, that then crystallizes into the horrors of and tragedy of the Holocaust itself. So Crystal Night, the end of the lawlessness, the barefaced lawlessness, becomes the beginning of a set of policies dealing with mistakes, dealing with issues of the war, that then crystallize into the horrors of Auschwitz, Sobibor, Treblinka, Belzec and Chelmno, leaving Berlin burned out by today in 1945. This synagogue was actually saved for Crystal Night by the Berlin Fire Brigade, a man called Wilhelm Creutzfeldt, who convinces the Nazi thugs or the fire brigade to be allowed to put the fire out. And the building was eventually bombed in 1943. It was used as a clothing store. During the East German years, there was a small community that was centered around the Rükestrasse synagogue up in Prenzlauer Berg. West Berlin, of course, would be attractive for Jews, for example, trying to leave the Soviet Union would come through West Berlin and head towards Israel. But the moment the wall fell and the community were reunited, Berlin now has again a vibrant, flourishing new Jewish community, and many from Israel, many of our colleagues, guides as well. And with that new beginning comes not just the positives, but the negatives. And I'll give you an example. This building was rebuilt. It's now a museum. It's got a place of worship on the top floor. And it's a museum to the community that was here and the characters that live within it. Einstein played the violin in here in January 1930. When it opened in 1866, it's a Moorish style. New York City dwellers might know the one on Lexington Avenue, similar style. You also got this Spanish North African style in Prague as well. Bismarck came to the opening of this in 1866. But you might be able to see there is a barrier and there is a police person there. So tragically, of course, these places become targets, places of historic Jewish story for contemporary world issues. So the dangers and the warnings still needed to be heeded. But Berlin now is one, the community move forward, not here, they're scattered all over the city. Most active synagogue, I suspect, is on the western side of the city. But this synagogue symbolizes the beginning of the end, emancipation, and a German Jewish community of acceptance that play a role in at every level of German society, in the destruction and horrors of the war, the pause of the fall of the wall, and the birth of the 21st century community today, with that caveat that it's got a barrier and 24-hour police, sadly. But we've come to the end If you liked it, like and subscribe. If you like this tour, please feel free to donate. The PayPal me at virtualberlintours.com. The link is in the description as well, I think, as well. You got any final questions? I'll leave you with a few minutes of a view of the synagogue as the sun goes down on this Sunday. Thank you, Diana, if you enjoyed the tour. PayPal me at Virtual Berlin Tours. I'd much appreciate that. You got other requests for tours? Just let me know. Thank you, Bar. It was great to see you again and share another part of Berlin's story with you. So I wish you all the best, and stay safe, and let's meet in Berlin and do another tour soon. Thank you, Diana. You can also donate through SANDEMANs Live as well. Thank you, Jill. It's been great to share this time with you. I'll see you next time, Laura from Indonesia as well. It looks great. Take care, folks. I'll see you soon.